I have always been the dreamer type compared to my brothers and sisters. I don't know, they seemed pretty satisfied with the kind of lifestyle we had, which was very frugal to say the least. I always thought that nothing good would come if I would just stay in one place and let the time pass me by as it rots away the possibilities of progress. We were living in the same exact routine every day. Same faces, same dreary food, same boring process that our parents lived and died with. Quite honestly, I was fed up with the repetition and, I decided to break free from our bleak existence. I ran away and took my chances, as what most dreamers say, for a brighter tomorrow. I moved out of our town in order to see what the world had to offer. But it wasn't all bright, as I came to realize. The world I looked forward to was nothing compared to the horror and inhumanity of the reality that unfolded before me. Now, I've been in difficult situations before I lived in that city. And although I actually enjoyed most of the experiences, and I consider them as substantial learning periods in my life, I was just a lost and ignorant 15-year-old kid when I began my journey. I snuck into a fishing boat and hid behind the fish bins. I survived almost a week eating off of what they caught. And needless to say, well, I guess you could say that they're pretty mad at me when they caught me. They decided to make me work for what I ate. And most of the crew were mean, but there were a few who showed some kindness. And I eventually became their assistant, or rather, a voluntary slave. After months of sailing back and forth, they left me at the port, and I worked there for a couple of years. And although it was already a different kind of lifestyle compared to what I had back in my town, it wasn't really the kind of living that I imagined for me. No. I wanted something far better than having a few bucks and free food. I decided to move to the town nearest to the port, and I was able to work in a shoddy restaurant where we deliver some of the fish. I was so proud of myself when I was finally able to afford rent, but this still wasn't the kind of life that I dreamed of. I was 21 years old when the restaurant finally closed down and I had to find a new job. I was invited to return to the port, back on the ships, but I rode the train heading to the closest city instead. I could still remember how thrilled I was. I'd heard nothing but great things about it. I just couldn't keep myself still on my seat as I envisioned what my life could be. I kept on visualizing scenarios as the train moved miles and miles from where I had been. As we finally arrived at the station, I was a bit overwhelmed by the number of people. It was my first time to see such an active and highly populated area. But what took me by surprise was the difference in living expenses. With the money I had at the time, there was no way I could afford the cheapest rent available. I saved my money solely for food, and I was forced to sleep in parks for months. And during those days, I felt like an ignorant kid again that aimlessly wandered off and jumped on a random boat. I watched different type of people pass by and wondered what kind of life they must be having. I imagined how better and more comfortable their situations must be compared to how mine was. I was envious of them, as I was just extremely dissatisfied and disappointed at myself. So after a series of rejections, I was finally able to acquire a bunch of random jobs. It was extremely hard for me to find proper work since, I barely went to school, and I knew more about fishing than computers. It was when I became a dishwasher for another cheap diner that I met Gary, a borderline pesky suburban hippie who loved to talk about random things. Not knowing anybody else, and as friendly and loud-mouthed as he was, we ended up sharing a place together in order to help each other for rent. He introduced me to some of his friends, and showed me a bunch of things that the city could offer. He taught me different ways to get through the day in the cheapest way possible. Gary may appear to be an eccentric idiot at first, but he definitely knew how to make tight situations seem lighter with his jovial personality. He toured me around the city during our day off, and even taught me how to drive using his van that had seen better days. At that point, I learned to adapt to this new kind of modern lifestyle. I was taught how to make ends meet in order to survive, and hopefully, to gradually strive in life. We both had our fair share of shortcomings as we spent most of our time together. I would get a bit emotional and tend to pointlessly lash out once in a while, and Gary would sometimes get too stoned to work or even just function as a normal person. We constantly applied for new jobs online, which was very new to me, but we rarely had replies. My previous job experiences didn't help boost my relatively underwhelming profile. Gary's profound knowledge of trivial things and the lack of office-related skill set didn't seem to fit most job requirements as well. Because of these random applications we were sending out on a daily basis, an opportunity came to the both of us that would turn things around in a far different way than we expected. What came to us was a link to a darker side of the system. The unethical things amidst the noisy streets, cleverly hidden in plain sight yet beyond the reach of the bright lights. An email popped up in my inbox one night. It was an invitation for an interview. It was from some kind of courier company that was looking for drivers to deliver their packages. With all the jobs that I applied to, I couldn't possibly remember all of them. But at the back of my head, I was almost certain that I wouldn't apply as a driver since I didn't have a license yet. I was trying to think really hard about it until Gary broke the silence in the apartment. He was noisier and jollier than ever. He told me that he got an invitation for the same job as well. I asked him if he knew the company, but it was pretty obvious that he wasn't concerned about its identity. I found it a bit odd that we both received the invitation at the same time, but there was no evident reason for me to remain suspicious that night. It was my first time to be invited for a job that wasn't ridiculously underpaid, and so I just decided to join Gary's noise and celebrated. Luckily, Gary knew someone that helped me get my driver's license in less than a week. It was one of his perks for being acquainted with questionable individuals on the streets. We went to the address that was given in the mail. It was some kind of warehouse without any labels or name to identify what kind of establishment it exactly was. There were 6 white vans parked in front of it, which didn't have any label either. What caught my attention were the several security cameras surrounding the area. Gary recognized what kind they were and told me that those were military grade and the best ones available at the time. Which, well, it was kind of ironic since the warehouse itself didn't look fancy at all. A few minutes later, a person walked out of the building and approached us. It was a big man, wearing proper office attire with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, showing his full-sleeve tattoos matched with a set of luxurious rings. He welcomed us with a full smile, showing some of his gold teeth, and he led us inside. The office inside the warehouse was very different from what the building looked like outside. We weren't expecting a walled aquarium and a fully carpeted red room. There were a collection of lavish antiques. The dark wooden table alone was sculpted intricately with Baroque designs. This room alone was so ridiculously luxurious to have inside of a warehouse that had the paint chipping off of it. And it was so utterly unnecessary for what was supposedly an office for a mere shipping company. The supervisor noticed how speechless we were, and I was aware that I had that very suspecting expression on my face. He broke the silence with his pompous laughter and told us that the owner was fond of pretty things. The supervisor told us what they were, as it said in the email. An independent courier company providing their services exclusively to Amazon. As I've seen on the shelves of the warehouse, the items were wrapped with standard Amazon packaging. They needed new delivery drivers since they just recently relocated and had to let go of the old ones. As he began the interview, I kept on looking around. I couldn't hear anything else aside from the fan and his voice. As a company that was hiring seemingly in random, since we were included, I assumed that more applicants would come to join. I asked the supervisor about it, and he said that he preferred to do his interviews one-on-one so he could assess the applicants more carefully. He even said that he wasn't expecting me and Gary to arrive at the same exact time. With a forced grin, I could easily tell that he was lying. I wanted to ask more questions, but Gary nudged his leg against mine, telling me to shut up. So I did. He was right though. We needed that job. I was just being too suspicious. Might cause our chances of losing it before we even begin. The supervisor continued with the interview. Most of the discussion was about the rules and how to use the navigating devices and the GPS, which was practically a phone. Every delivery driver received one and used it. And since there were 2 of us there, he assigned us to deliver heavy loads as some sort of trial. And so we did. There were only 8 large boxes that needed to be delivered, with each drop location just a few miles away from one another. The supervisor strictly said that we should only use their vans during delivery service. So we did. For our trial, we finished all the deliveries in less than 3 hours. We even had some smoke breaks in between. It was enough to impress our supervisor. Gary was a rowdy driver, and I wouldn't be surprised if we made it even earlier. We were immediately hired, paid, and asked to come back the next day to officially begin. Gary and I headed back home feeling quite proud of ourselves. We were so glad that we even forgot to ask what the name of the company was. The supervisor didn't mention it during the discussion either. What I only noticed was a very small stamp on each package. It was a black logo of what looked like a cobweb. We were assigned different routes the next day. Gary and I had our own delivery vans. We had no uniform of any kind, and all that was given to us were IDs saying Amazon. Now, I was a bit nervous at first, but I was able to complete my own deliveries by just following the GPS. As weeks gone by, I got used to the job and memorized most of the routes. The process gradually became mindless. Scan the package, go to the location as fast as possible, and confirm the drop. A lot of the packages were delivered to the same addresses, like regular customers, so I didn't have to always rely on the GPS to find them. I rarely see the people that I had to deliver to, aside from a very specific few, and I actually preferred not seeing them since most of whom I saw were quite oddly peculiar individuals. One of these were a very old couple that always had the same song playing every time I went there. They always had their door open, but they never looked at me nor even moved. I once wasted 20 minutes standing at their front door just to see them blink, but they never did. They were always in the same spot like lifeless mannequins. And then there was this guy who was always in his boxers, wearing a gas mask. He would eagerly wait for his package to arrive every time. He would open the door right before I placed the package on the floor, snatch it from my hands, and then rudely slam the door. I guess aside from these quite weird encounters and questionable late-night schedules, I had nothing else to complain about. I was earning more compared to any other job I ever had, and within relatively shorter working hours. Gary and I barely had time to hang out like before due to our conflicting schedules, and so we decided to meet up with his friends for a few drinks. Gary started bragging about our new job. Just like me, he also had a bunch of stories about quite interesting characters he met during his deliveries. I also learned from him that some of the recipients' names on the packages were only aliases or usernames. Apparently, one of his friends that joined us was also a delivery guy working directly from Amazon. Unlike us, he shared nothing but a bunch of complaints. He told us that only the few months were good, but the number of the packages he had to deliver increased to a ridiculous amount. Gary and I couldn't relate to him. We were only delivering 25 packages max each day. There were even days that we had less than 10. And aside from the huge difference in deliveries we had to make, he was shocked when he knew that our salary was higher than his. He eagerly asked us which distribution center we were working for. And so we told him that we were just working for a small shipping company that provides service to Amazon. And it was then that we realized that we still didn't know the name of our company when he asked us about it, despite us working there for months. Gary and I felt like idiots at the time. The only thing I knew about our company was the small logo that I found on the packages during our first delivery service. I described the logo to him so that he could look it up, and one of our friends recognized it immediately. We were told that this black spider web logo was being used to signify the dark web. Now, I had no idea what the hell they were going on about. And quite honestly, Gary sat there and just laughed about it. They told me that the dark web was practically a hidden platform used for illegal or ethically unacceptable activities, some of which were quite disturbing. It was a nest for the black market and a web space that most people couldn't access or wouldn't even dare to see. They kept on telling me disturbing events that happened in the dark web. Like Gary, I simply just laughed about it until we left. But my thoughts were changed on the following night. During one of my late-night deliveries, Gary suddenly called and asked for my help. He crashed his van on a tree, which wrecked the entire front of it. I immediately went to his location to pick him up. I was pissed off when I arrived. Luckily, Gary didn't hurt himself. I saw him standing right next to the wrecked driver's seat, totally stoned. And I was so pissed, I was about to beat some sense into him until I saw what he was staring at. He found a small camera hidden behind the shattered rearview mirror. It was also damaged during the wreck. I was about to ask what it was for when he signaled me to not make a sound. Aside from the camera, he also discovered an audio bug inside the dashboard. We stared at each other, completely confused, and then his phone rang. Our supervisor called to check the situation. He told Gary that he knew I came to help him, and instead of asking first if Gary was hurt, the supervisor asked if any of the packages were damaged. After knowing that all the goods were fine, he asked me to assist Gary in completing his deliveries. At first, I told him that I should bring my friend to the hospital and make sure that he's alright. But he kept on insisting that we should get the job done first before anything else, since Gary said to him that he was feeling okay anyway. He also told us that he noticed Gary was under the influence of drugs when he came to the warehouse, which was probably the reason why he crashed. He wanted us to think that he was kind enough to let this slip just so we would deliver the packages. Gary reluctantly nodded his head. He was staring at me as if he wanted to say something. I was forced to agree just so that I could hang up the phone and get the night over with. As I ended the call, Gary immediately pulled me at the back of the van. He told me that the supervisor was lying, but admitted that he also did something he wasn't supposed to. Gary opened one of the packages he was supposed to deliver. He recognized the username of the recipient and told me that this guy was known for selling incredibly strong cannabis strains. As a pothead, he failed to hold back. I could clearly see that. He just crashed his van, which could have killed him, discovered a couple of surveillance devices in it. Yet he was quite cheerful while he was describing me this weed that, well, I couldn't care less about. Anyway, we transferred his packages to my van, and I was down to my last 2 deliveries for the night, so it would have been fine to give him a hand even if the situation wasn't as bad as it was. And before we hopped in, Gary folded up my rearview mirror so the camera wouldn't see what we were doing. He played incredibly loud music from his phone and placed it on the dashboard right where he saw the audio bug on his. And we went on ahead. He wrote his thoughts concerning the surveillance devices and made me read it. And at that point, he was certain that we were operating for some business on the dark web and not Amazon. He also told me that the package he opened was also meant to be sold. A few moments later, Gary went at the back of the van as we were halfway from the drop location. I didn't really care what he was trying to do until I smelled what he was smoking. I kept on yelling at him to stop, but the music was too loud and he was having too much fun to listen to me. We finally arrived at one of the addresses we would deliver to. Because the rearview mirror was folded up, and I also got high since Gary turned the van into a hotbox, I failed to see the car behind us as I was hastily reversing to park. Luckily, the car didn't have an alarm, and no one saw me back up into it. As the van jolted from hitting the car, I looked to the back to check on Gary, and I also heard some of the packages fall from the pile. I was deeply shocked with what I saw. Gary leaned on the pile of packages when he lost his balance, which ripped one of the boxes open. Inside the package was a tightly sealed plastic bag containing a human arm. Both of us were completely terrified. Gary's cheerful mood was completely overwhelmed by fear. Although we were finally aware that our packages were from transactions on the dark web, we weren't expecting that it would lead to this extent. Gary asked me what we should do, and he repeated his question several times before it reached me. We noticed that it had gotten quiet. His phone fell off the dashboard and it turned off. Anything we would say at that moment could be easily heard by whoever was behind the surveillance system. I signaled Gary to not say a word. I checked the list of both our deliveries as I struggled to stop my hands from shaking. Bad luck, well, it came with several successive waves, or perhaps by the consequences of our bad decisions, and I realized that the package Gary accidentally ripped open was the one that we were supposed to drop in that exact location. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I recognized the house when I stepped out of the van. Now I was probably too stoned that I failed to notice it earlier. This package delivery wasn't Gary's. It was mine. And I had been delivering packages here several times. It was the house of the old couple, playing the exact same song every time. I tried to collect my senses and calm down as much as I could. I wanted to pretend that it was just one of the ordinary days which I would just leave the package at their doorstep and go. Gary tried to hide the rip of the box with packing tape. A few minutes later, I grabbed the package and slowly walked toward the house. The door was open as usual, The same exact song was playing again, and the couple were at their exact positions like always. I approached the door one step at a time, and I was so tensed and frightened that a pin drop would send me running. A bunch of questions were inside my head as I got closer. What was the arm for? Who has been picking up these packages from the door? And was there anybody else in the house aside from them? And have I been delivering body parts all this time? I slowly placed down the box at their doorstep, and I almost screamed when someone whispered behind me. It was Gary. Fucking Gary. He was asking me something. I didn't realize he had followed me. Hell, I failed to hear what he said before, so he repeated his question again. He was asking if the couple were dead. And as I was looking at Gary, slowly trying to absorb his question, his facial expression suddenly changed. His eyes went wider. I could hear his breathing getting short and rapidly increasing. He was profoundly terrified by what was in front of him. I didn't want to turn my head. I didn't want to see what he was seeing. But my neck seemed to be snapping back on its own, and I couldn't stop it. I didn't know what it exactly was that triggered this different scenario. It could have been Gary's whisper, which sounded new to them, or something else which I didn't know. The old couple, that seemed like lifeless mannequins, finally turned their heads with such terrifying and piercing stares. A few seconds later, a shadow was cast in front of me. It was coming from right above me. As I looked up to see what it was, I saw a head peeking from behind the door. Gary immediately pulled me and we ran back to our vehicle as fast as our feet would allow us. I jumped at the back of the van as Gary immediately started the engine and kicked on the gas. As we got back on the road, the tension were gradually lifted off of our chests. But the night was far from over, and my phone suddenly rang. I thought it would be the supervisor, but it was a deep voice of a man I couldn't recognize. I failed to contain my anger, so I started shouting and cursing at him. I told him everything we knew, and that I would tell the cops all about it. He calmly responded. He told me to look at the address of our next drop on Gary's list, and that I should ask him about it. And so I did. Gary had been delivering packages to that address almost regularly. It was the chief of police hiding behind an alias for his underground transactions and activities. I didn't know how to react after hearing what Gary said. In a very blunt yet calm manner, the man congratulated me for delivering the arm. He joked about us running off from the old couple's house like a couple of madmen. It was his way of saying that he could see everything that we do. He told me that the others would be expecting their packages, and all of them knew that we were the ones that deliver them. I looked at Gary as if I were expecting him to say something about it. I could no longer decide on my own at that point. I didn't know what to do. It seemed as if we became a part of a system that had been running behind the scenes for years and years. But Gary didn't say anything, and he just kept on driving. And after a moment of long pause, I was suddenly appeased, the feeling that was different than before. It was as if my eyes were finally opened or went totally closed. I put down the phone and checked if there were any other damaged packages, and I looked on our list to see if we were still on schedule. I went back at the front seat, and we quietly moved forward. We were part of the system, and there was no getting out.